So I'd like to say good afternoon to everyone, and hope you're having a fun time today. Is this everybody's first time being, or how many people is this their first time being here? There's a couple of them. Yeah, I've only been here once before, so it's pretty cool. So my name is John Survant, and my partner here is Don Wolfe, and we're going to talk today about why breaches occur. And I'm not going to claim to know everything about that, but I have a few opinions. I was hoping this would be more of a discussion, but it might be kind of hard to do that without, because it's such a big room and stuff. So we met in the EMBA program, which is a joint program. It's an executive EMBA program that's held by Louisville and Lexington in the UK. And so we were both students of that program, and so we've started this little startup. It's called 3W Security, and the product is a reconciler, but I still have a full-time job. So anyways, just a little bit about us as some background. We have an interesting combination. Don, why don't you start off and tell a little bit about yourself first?
All right, so I'm a retired Colonel Don Wolfe. I'm a retired SF Colonel, Special Forces Colonel. I've done counterterrorism around the globe. I was a Middle Eastern expert. I speak Arabic. When John approached me about this concept, it's like, hey dude, I don't understand. I'm not a tech, I'm an action guy. And he said, no, you've got some world of experience in security, and I think the principles apply. So we started talking, and when you consider security, can anybody tell me any differences between physical security and internet security? Anybody? How about one's online, one's not? The principles are all the same, but the one thing in security that a lot of people seem to overlook is mindset. And so for security, it's really easy if you break it down into people, process, and technology. And IT security is no different. The difference between a guy walking or getting ready to assault into a room or into a building or come off of a helicopter, you guys have seen Black Hawk Down and all that stuff. Situational awareness has got to be maintained because your personal safety depends on it. So you have to be aware 360 degrees, you got to know who's on your left, who's on your right, what you're doing, all those really basic elements. And you think about it and it's like, okay, I got it. It's a constant mindset. But when you talk about IT security, that's when you think, is it really relevant all the time? Because when you're sitting behind a computer in the comfort of your warm office or cold offices, I've been in some of them, I know how cold it gets, and they don't even let you put the space heaters underneath the desks anymore for safety reasons. I get it. But it's no different. And what is different is that you get that sense of comfort. And so most IT security managers have checklists on timelines that you have to maintain. And it's like, yeah, I'll get to that in a minute. Then you get a phone call and you get distracted. And then a day or two later, it's like, yeah, I still need to do that. And then before you know it, you've got a breach. Or something happens. Or you go to a printer and you leave personally identifiable information on the printer. And then the safety officer or somebody's coming to you saying, hey, what's going on? Well, through our conversations, we've realized that by combining people, process, and technology into our product, we believe that we can really differentiate and make a difference in companies that need to ensure their risk is mitigated. And so what we're going to talk about today is about how to prevent breaches. And we're not just going to do a product sell and talk about our company. We're going to talk about the actual process. So with that said, I'll turn it back over to John.
So my background, Don has all this national security experience. Then I have the IT experience. And so I've been through process of integrating 9 different acquisitions into our security program. And then we were purchased by a multinational company and integrated into their security program. And so I've seen how startups do it and then how the more advanced companies do it. And I've learned a lot through that. There's things that startups do well. There's things that the larger organizations do well. So why do breaches occur? I'm going to start off by just put yourself in the situation. I mean, this is the thing that none of us want to happen, okay? But let's just pretend for a minute. You're the CEO. It's September 7th, 2017. And you have to announce to the whole country that their records were breached. The next day, your stock plunges 14%. A couple days later, 2 senior executives retire, and then you have to offer another apology. A couple days later, your chief information officer retires, and then your chief security officer retires. Now you're left holding the bag, and a couple weeks later, you're the CEO and you're fired. So if that's all it was just a quick event and it stopped right there, maybe you could get over it. I don't know. But even today, it's still going on. There's like a $700 million settlement. Executives have lost their bonuses. Then people were accused of insider trading. And future employment would be pretty difficult, I guess, after that. So anybody know who the company is? Somebody knows. Want to take a guess? Yeah, it was. So I'm picking on our competitor a little bit. But, honestly, it could happen to anyone. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get across today is to kind of explore why this might have happened. So the Equifax was, they had a vulnerability called Apache struts. And, I'm a very technical person and understand a lot of these vulnerabilities, but I don't think I even knew about this at the time. But I wasn't responsible for that area either. But it was a published vulnerability, and it sat out there unfixed for a while. And so there was a lot of risk there that happened that didn't need to happen. And so again, I'm going to ask the same question again. Why did that happen? And if you, was it a people problem? Was it a process? Did a process fail? Was it technology? Enough funding? I'll just take a poll and see what people think between those areas. Who thinks it was a people problem? Okay, a couple. Process. See, technology. Maybe funding. Funding problem. And honestly, I don't know the answer. And I don't think that I would necessarily trust what the official answer was. When you get in these big companies, there's a lot of politics and there's a lot of leadership decisions, and not always the right people are making the right decisions. And so there's one of my biggest questions is, was this risk made known to the Equifax board? So the board members, their responsibility is to protect the value of the shareholders and, to help the company make money or whatever. But they're the ones that's supposed to be looking out for this type of thing. The problem is who in this room would want to go to a board member and try to tell them about Apache struts? I mean, it's just, but at some point in time, if that message is not reaching that level of management, then there's a problem. And I guess the point that I'm trying to say is if the board members knew that this level of risk was out there, you can be sure that they would have addressed it. And so my theory is that it probably was somewhere between the director, the managers, and the executives within the company. Somewhere that message didn't get shared. And so, I mean, what can we do in our organizations to fix that problem? And it's a hard thing to do, because if you're under the CEO, how do you share that message, Or if you are the CEO, how can you encourage your employees to tell you about things without, opening your door every day for a long discussion. So here's another example, the Marriott. I mean, all these poor people did is they bought Starwood, who had already been breached. And I'm sure they did a bunch of due diligence and stuff, but I don't know how you could. It's hard enough to know if your own company's breached without buying another company that's already had the problem. So what do the experts say? And so kind of, I talked about us trying to come up with this new product. And so we've been interviewing a bunch of people to try to figure out where they think the problems are in the security programs. And so I've come up with 5 areas, and this is similar, I guess, to the top 5 SANS type of stuff that you keep hearing, but I've tried to make it more of an interview with people. So I'm curious just to get feedback on this. If you want to tell me afterwards, or even if you have a comment, you could always come up here. Don has the mic. So the very biggest area that I think is the management and culture of an organization. I told you about the different startups that I worked in, and one of the earlier companies that I worked with, there was a guy that he was a brilliant businessman, and he said, we're just going to design all these products and we're going to throw them up against the wall and see what sticks. And when we find what sticks, we'll go with that. And we're not going to worry about any information security or anything like that right now. As soon as we know what sticks and it starts working, we're going to go back and fix all the security stuff. Well, sure, do you all know where this is going? I mean, some of you have worked in this field a while, so I see a few snickers. They didn't really go back and fix the security stuff once they found out what stuck, because then they were so excited about the new features. And I don't want to say that they didn't go back and fix it eventually, but it didn't really happen the way the story was originally told. So that's one thing about your culture. The organizations that I'm working for now is actually, they're totally different. I mean, security is like one of the number 1 goals of, the top 3 goals every year. It's way at the top. And I mean, the executives in that company, they know what IDS is and firewalls and all this technology stuff. It's crazy. I mean, I'm talking about the CEOs can sit there and talk about administrator rights and stuff like that. So, some of these leaders are getting it and they're understanding. But, when you're at a startup, you really don't have that luxury. You think about it, well, you created a company yesterday and now you have to figure out if you can make money. You don't have time to build a security program. So that happens over time. But anyways, the number 1 thing I think is getting that culture right. Making sure that people know that security is everyone's job.
John, if I may.
Yeah, jumping.
So people is one part of the problem. Process is the other. How many people know that there's products out there that you could purchase that would make your job easier and make the company safer? Anybody? And then what does that become a question of? Whether or not your company buys it. It's a question of priorities, right? But it's also a question of understanding. Does your executives understand exactly what it is? So whose role and responsibility is it to make those executives or those decision makers understand that priority? It's got to be the IT security guy. So in a lot of organizations, the culture does not promote open information exchange. And they'll tell you, I was in the Army. It doesn't get any more bureaucratic than that. And we have a POM process, the Program Objective Memorandum, that's tied to the President's budget. And you literally have to be 5 years outside of the purchasing life cycle in order to get a new requisition for 5 years later. It's ridiculous. Now they can expedite it. Obviously, the speed of change, a lot of that has changed. And they talk about using soft procurement, soft as Special Operations Force procurement, because we just go out and buy COTS, commercial off the shelf. Because we're here to solve problems. We're not here to deal with the bureaucracy of the POM, the budget cycle. So that can be the reality. So you have to recognize what is our culture, and then really the most successful IT security managers are those that fully understand the process and know timing when's the best time to go talk to an executive about security shortfalls? Is it during a monthly update? Is it at the end of the year when extra money comes around for end of year spend or whatever you call it? But it's always the combination of people, and when I say people, I mean mindset, and process, I mean, is it easy to use?
Yeah, so the next area I'll talk about is asset management. And this one is what drives me crazy. But, it's impossible to secure something if you don't know that it exists. And so, a lot of companies struggle with this, especially when you get to a much larger size. But, you really have to do this right. You might just by accident secure something if you don't know that it exists. But anyways, that's, how do you know that all of your different security processes are being done across this asset if you don't know that it exists? And I'm sure, you guys work in this, so you probably know that. Then there's the technical challenges was a really big area too. This is, that maybe that's what happened on this Equifax thing, is that there was a piece of software had to be rewritten or something like that. How many times have you heard that? But again, if you have this communication path that's going up to the executives and this level of trust that you can say something and they're going to believe you, and you're not just like complaining or whatever, you can bet that if that issue required a software rewrite, that developer would, all the other priorities would be dropped and they would have taken care of that one. Access control, this one, everybody kind of knows that. It only takes one account. This was just an awful problem to try to fix. And then understanding the risk, we've kind of already talked on this before, but at the end of the day, the executives that are making these decisions, when you come to them with an issue, the main thing they want to know is like, is this something I need to be worried about or not? They don't really care what it does and how your explanation of it is, but they just want to know, is this something I need to be worried about? And the thing about this is there's a lot of us in security, I think we've all done it at some point in time, but some more than others, is, if you're the type that's always worried about, we're not following this best practice, and it's a really big problem, or the right way to do this is X, Y, and Z, and it's just, you're really upset about that all the time. If you're always complaining and about things that are little issues, then it's kind of like crying wolf. And so when a real issue comes along and you try to bring it up to one of the higher up managers, they may not believe you. And it doesn't even have to be you who was the one that was crying wolf. It could have been someone else. Because some of the executives I've worked with, they're tired of just hearing from security people. I'm just saying that's just what it is. So this is just like a little note that I found online about Congress. They basically, in their opinion, that Equifax and the Marriott they were negligent, basically. And, I have to think that those two companies were doing what they thought was best. At least the security people in those companies were doing as best job as what they knew how. I have to believe that. But that kind of puts us in a scary position too, because how many of us are trying to do the right things? It could happen to us. And so I really think that's why it goes back to these other issues, getting that leadership right. You might not be able to fix the leadership, but you can have the conversations to try to help make a change. So what are the top causes of breach? This was just like a little study that I did to kind of see. The HIPAA wall of shame, this was from 2017 to 2019. I kind of threw some categories together, but the majority you can see is hacking incidents. There was some theft and some loss. And I think like when this first came out, from what I remember, it was the DLP, the loss of devices, was one of the biggest areas. And I think a lot of companies have kind of gotten a handle on that. So I don't see that numbers. The hacking is a lot higher now. And then I pulled this as another list of breaches off of Wikipedia. It was not conclusive at all, but again, here you kind of see the same trend of a lot of hacking incidents, lost and stolen media. And then, of course, the types of organizations are all those organizations that have either credit cards or some kind of personal information or whatnot.
John, did you make any correlation between the types of organizations and the type of information that's being stolen?
No, I didn't. I do know this is an interesting thing. Because I worked at a healthcare company. A lot of these were healthcare startups and stuff. And I've been in this business a long time, so these leaders are long gone. But they used to say, a lot of them be like, healthcare information, who would want to steal that? Why would anybody even want to steal that? So they thought the HIPAA was just a ridiculous set of legislation. But I mean, as many of you guys know these days, it's the more valuable of all the data right now. So anyway, I just thought that was kind of interesting. But those leaders are long gone. So. Okay, so here's the thing. This is what we're all doing, right? Audits, pen tests. I mean, not everybody can even afford the pen tests or a monthly vulnerability scanning tool. But my point is I bet that a lot of these companies that are being breached are still using, this is what they're doing. So that's my little joke here, the definition of insanity. If we keep on doing these same things and we don't adopt some of these other tools, then, we're going to end up in the same place. And I can say, there's some, I don't know all the vendors that were downstairs, but there were some pretty cool technologies that are out there. You can't buy all of them, but I do know that there are some neat technologies coming up. So what's the problem with pen testing? Well, it happens. Does anybody do, like, after you do an important change on the network, you have a pen test? Does anybody do that? There's one. You're supposed to for PCI. Everybody that does that, you're supposed to have it tested after changes and stuff like that. But it's just not unless you have an in-house team, you can't do that. It's very like cost prohibitive. And so really that's the big problem with pen testing is, let's say you set up a new machine and it has a vulnerability or something like that. Well, it might be half a year before it gets found. And I'm going to tell on myself on here for one thing. This is a little embarrassing, but it happened a long, long time ago. But just to show you, like, when you have a mistake. Well, let me tell you. So I set up this logging server, and it showed like all of our Active Directory logs. So it'd be all of our user accounts, our machine names, and all these things. And I was excited about it, and I put it out in the firewall in a firewall group, and it was like our web server group, and it was for internal web servers or whatever. But it allowed port 80, and it just so happens that it also sat in a firewall rule that had a NAT address. Like I used an IP that had been used in the past, so I didn't know there was already a rule out there or that had that IP address in it. And I didn't know about this until a pen test about 6 months later. So that's my point is, and if you know me, I'm very detail oriented and I'm always like being real careful and stuff like that, or at least I thought so. But the thing is, without having some sort of tool to be able to detect that type of stuff, then you're kind of, exposing yourself. So I'm just curious, has anybody heard of attack surface mapping before? I see a couple of nods. That's it's kind of like an automated pen test in a way. And that's our project that we're working on. It's to solve problems like that. Let's see. Now, you could say, well, I'm not worried about the pen testing all the time because I'm going to do vulnerability scans. And I think they're getting a lot better with vulnerability scans these days. But one of the problems with vulnerability scans is it doesn't necessarily address the risk very well. You got their, Qualys and some of these other vendors, they'll have 1 through 10 or 1 through 5 or something like that. But it doesn't really, you don't really have the context and the metadata that goes along with that. Like, what product does this go to? What's the name of it? Sometimes the name's missing. And maybe it's a high vulnerability from one perspective, but it's not even on your network. So that's kind of problems with that part of our business. And then, of course, sometimes you might even have a vulnerability scanner that's not even, you don't even have the network being scanned. So I don't know if anybody ever done that before. I'm telling about all the mistakes that I've had here in public, but let's see. So, and then the asset management, we talked about this a little bit already, but is your external inventory, is it accurate? Do you know about things? Would you know if somebody set up a new business in the cloud and linked it to your site? Or would you know it if somebody that was like an IT person set up a new FTP site for their own personal usage or whatever? I mean, that type of thing doesn't happen very, very often. But there's a lot of different things like that if we're not actively looking at these things, then it becomes a problem. And then I hate to even mention this, back on the vulnerability scans, I just remembered this one right here. How many of you have ever had vulnerability scans month to month, but you don't ever look at the scans? Anybody ever done that? I mean, it gets tedious, and you're trying to run in all these directions, and you've got all these fancy network tools that you've installed, and you've got all these checklists that you're following. And sometimes that feels like you're playing a game of freeze tag with Lamar Jackson. You just can't kind of catch him. Has anybody been watching Lamar Jackson play? He's incredible. And he was the Louisville quarterback, for those who don't know. And I'm a big UK fan, but I still love to watch him. He's playing for the Ravens now, and nobody drafted him until it was like the last day of the draft. He won the Heisman Trophy, which is the highest rank, in football the year before. But there was 3 guys that they were kind of like, they're thinking maybe they're going to be the next Tom Brady. So Lamar Jackson was on the very bottom of that whole list, but now he's killing it. So anyways, so how do you set up a program? How do you set up a program that's not going to fail? And I mean, we're all still trying to figure this out, right? But this is what I've come up with. You have to have that leadership foundation first. I mean, you have to be able to trust. The leaders have to be able to trust you, and you have to be able to trust the leaders. I mean, you could probably say something about that. Do you have anything to talk about that?
No.
No? He's got a story for everything.
So as we talk about mindset and culture, if your leader's focusing on IT security, the whole organization probably is, right? Well, what if let me go back to the reasons that you get breached. So we talked about the ways that you're breached, and we talked about the types of organizations. Well, let's talk about the hacker, because this is one of those leadership mindset things that people forget, that the enemy gets a vote. And depending on the way the enemy, or in this case a hacker, reacts, is going to drive your reaction, right? So what's the hacker going after? Why are they doing it? Do they have a specific purpose? Maybe to kill the credibility of a competitor or something? Maybe they're hired to do that. I mean, you can only think of 1,000 reasons. You know why most targets get attacked? Anybody? Because they're easy. They're easy targets. You ever heard the concept of a hard target? A hard target has layers of security around it. You've got far security, which is maybe road bumps leading up to the White House. And then you're going through. And remember how you used to be able to just drive straight through open gates? Well, now they have snakes. They have big barriers put up that force you to slow down and go through. You know why that happens? Remember the bombing in Beirut and Lebanon? I mean, that truck got all the way into the Marine Corps barracks and killed 178 Marines. So you got to slow them down. And then when you slow them down, now you can fix them. There's a targeting methodology. It's called F3EAD. Find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, decide. The enemy, the hackers, are going through the same process, but it really comes down to how hard is it? Is it easy? And a lot of them are just targets of opportunity. And so the leadership foundation that you need to have is no more than creating a security mindset. And if you focus on allocating resources, you know, I got a question for you, John. So you've talked about how expensive some of the software is. You've talked about how expensive the pen testing is. What if you need both? How does the leaders make those decisions?
So my perspective is that if you train your teams to learn more of the background code, you pay that price. You know, teach them how to use Python, teach them how to get their hands dirty and not just use all the GUI tools that you can actually save a lot of money. I mean, at the end of the day, you can't buy all the tools. You have to figure out which ones. So if you don't want to do that and you don't want to teach everybody Python and stuff, I understand. But then really risk management. I mean, that's it. You've got to figure out of those tools which one really protects you. And a lot of times you can do things that don't cost a lot of money. It just requires a little bit of change in mindset. So like, let's say you got an FTP server and you got all these different accounts and stuff, and somebody says, well, we don't want to put a firewall on the FTP server. Well, instead you end up buying some fancier FTP server that does blacklisting and all these other things. You could have just put a firewall on it and just take that extra step of only allowing each customer to connect with that FTP server. So that's an example of making the right decisions and saving some money.
So in terms of risk mitigation, wouldn't you say that all security measures come at a cost?
They do. Now, here's another thing. I'll tell you what, one of the CEOs that I worked with, I learned so much for. He would say, where can I get the most bang for my buck? Because he would only give me 5 things. He's like, you don't come to me with 20 things. Just give me 5. And I want to know of all these things, where do I get the most bang for my buck that's the easiest to achieve? So one of the big things that we did was, okay, we're going to block all other countries with the firewall. And so we put in checkpoints software for that. And I mean, you still have everybody's address in the United States here, but at least all those other countries that are scanning out there, they didn't see us. So that's an example of risk management and focusing on areas where you can make big improvements fast.
So there's a lot of organizations out there that just don't have the budget to support a lot of the things that we're talking about up here. But is mindset cost anything?
Yeah, that didn't cost anything.
Maybe in terms of onboarding or training and development, but really if you implement the mindset of security as a precautionary measure, as a standard operating procedure, that costs you nothing, or it might cost you an hour or 2 out of the week. But in terms of being able to buy the appropriate security software, now you're getting into exponential numbers. And then the services to implement those and then the time that you're taking your workforce to learn those new tools. So, you can often tell your bosses, it's like you can't afford not to invest in this stuff. Because when you compare it to all of the other areas that we could mitigate risk from, this is a no-brainer. And it all comes down to mindset, culture, prevention of loss in terms of people and equipment. And you really got to understand the process. But a lot of people think it's all the process. And I always argue when it starts with people. I have a favorite saying that we talk about all the time. Mission first, people always. Well, the mission for an IT security manager is to protect your information and your network. What does people mean? People means you got to educate people on what those security measures are, why it's important for them. And so if you really implement the principles of security and you think about it as simple, and you got to simplify everything. So just simply people, process, and technology. But if you buy expensive technology, and you don't pay for the implementation and the proper training, then it's not going to matter to the people, and it's definitely going to hurt your organization.
So Don was asking me as we were kind of going through this the other day. I was talking about this issue with the executive teams don't always understand what these technology issues are, and he's like, well, don't you do security training every year or something like that? And I was like, yeah, but not to understand the type of stuff that we're dealing with. But it gave me an idea. It's like, what if you had better training that you could provide to your executive teams, or I'm assuming most of everybody in here isn't CEOs, but you might be. I mean, what if that didn't cost anything other than a little bit of time and maybe putting together some material and see if they're interested in learning just a little bit of basics about security. It's another thing that you can do in thinking out of the box a little bit and not necessarily cost some money. So the other thing besides the leadership is the layered approach. In a minute, Don, I might ask you about that. But what I wanted to say about this, because we talked about this Equifax issue, and I don't know if this is common with other people or not, but I've been in organizations and situations where I felt like I wanted to say something about a risk, but it involves going around my direct reporting relationship or something like that. And so, there's different managers that may approach things different ways, and that's okay. We might have different opinions. It doesn't mean that, that they don't care about the risk. It means that they're handling it different. But if you have different layers and different ways for that information to channel up to executives, then they can make those decisions. Now, I don't know exactly how you do that, but I'm sure that in the different organizations that we're in, there's situations where people at lower levels know about risk that the upper levels don't know about. So setting up some kind of a feedback loop there to where those type of things could be communicated, I think is valuable. Because, I've seen that type of thing in a lot of situations, So what does layered approach mean, like in the national security?
Well, so let's get back to the enemy, or to hackers. What do you think layered approach means? Anybody heard the term path of least resistance? When somebody's coming into an area, like I talked about before, there's going to be signs or indicators that, hey, there's people watching. You pull into a strip mall or something and you see cameras on the corners. And then you go inside a building and there may or may not be someone there, a security guard. And then there might be a security guard with a wand who's waving you in, checking for metal. There could be 2 or 3 guards past them that are now armed and standing right by the elevator. So there's different layers of security that you would use in a physical security case. But for IT security, once again, if you take on the mindset of what is the easiest way for hackers to find or get into your network, and what is it? We talked, briefly talked about attack surface mapping. If your assets are vulnerable either through open portals or unchecked areas, they're just probing. They're just looking to see what I can get a hit on. And so if they get in that first layer, okay, that's good. Then they hit a firewall. Okay, now you've stopped them. Now what do they do? They're going to find another target, or they're going to go probe somewhere else. So a layered approach is just simply a mindset to slow down and detect and monitor your system so that you can ultimately prevent any issues to your network.
Yep. And so, obviously the keeping good metrics and KPIs are good, but you still have to have that element of trust so that you can share these issues. We've already talked a lot about asset management, so I'll skip that, but the risk management framework, one of the companies I worked at, I'm kind of laughing because we would have this risk committee that we would meet every month, and we would talk about it, and everybody would agree that we had these risks, and then we would leave. It was like a counseling session. We'd come back the next month and we'd have the same thing. And, committees are great, but if there's nobody that's there to actually make a decision, then that's kind of a problem because we didn't have the executive leaders taking part in this. And then these are the type of mistakes that organizations might make as they're growing older. And it's our job as security professionals to try to identify those things and gracefully address those issues. I mean, I don't know. Some of these problems are hard to address if you're not the leader. And if you don't have a good trust and a good relationship with the leader so that you could tell them about this issue. But it's well worth your time to try to establish that relationship and spend a little bit of time and try to think, how can I communicate this in a way that they'll be able to understand what I'm saying and that they'll get it. Because, as long as you're not just complaining about something that's probably not going to happen, that's actually not even important to them, as long as you can actually explain it in a way that they actually understand it and get it, then, you've kind of achieved the goal there. Kind of hit that topic there. So, are we doing enough? I guess there's obviously some things that we could do more. Again, I think that there are some really neat technologies that are out there these days. I don't. Does anybody have any suggestions or any things that you've seen that you think is really more cutting edge? Like I know that there's some kind of a TiVo or something like that. I don't remember what the name of the product was, where they have these honeypots that are sitting out there. I think that's a really good technology. A lot of the stuff around access control, like the Okta, is a great thing because you can really eliminate accounts from a lot of different places. And so there are some technologies. Does anybody have any that you think are just awesome these days? That's fine. It's probably not a good avenue to say it, but so anyways. So I guess, Don, I'll leave you with this one thing. Can you tell them about no-fail security, or no-fail mission? And
so there's a few national elements within the military and the Department of Defense and the National Security Agency that essentially are to protect and defend and prevent threats against the United States and our national interests abroad. They literally, there's a handful of organizations that literally have the two words, no fail, in those missions. And I was honored enough to command one of those organizations for a while. And the difference between a regular Army unit and our unit, anybody tell me what you think those differences are? Training. What else? It really comes down to two simple things. Resourcing and equipping. And so you've got And actually later on in my life, I worked for the Special Operations Command as an assessment officer. And we got one of those genius questions from the House Intelligence Committee or somewhere in DC, these politicians, asking the question of, well, why does an operator wear level 4 body armor with porcelain plates that protect up to a 7.62 shot, and our truck drivers are wearing, think, World War II vintage shrapnel jackets, flak vests? And can anybody figure out what the difference is? We're talking about cost. But so I am literally the operator on the ground. I'm a staff officer now, but I was given that job because of my practical experience as an operator. And so I was thinking, okay, how do you tell a layman the difference between me and the truck driver that got me to the target? And I started thinking about it. I'm like, wait a minute, to the target. So it ultimately came down to, and the way we satisfied that answer was it became proximity to target, risk mitigation. I'm going in the fatal funnel. I'm going in to kill, capture, or rescue someone, so I'm more likely to get shot than that truck driver is. So it really became proximity to target. What's the distance? How close? What are the percentage or the likelihood of you getting hurt or shot directly? And so that's what it came down to. IT security is the same thing. What's more important, to protect the network or to prevent an attack against the network? And then, go ahead.
To prevent it, yeah.
And then what is your organization's culture? Ask them that same question. You can be as rhetorical or direct as you want to talking about security, but you cannot deny that the conversation needs to happen. And if you make it as simple as process, protect, defend, deter, detect, I mean, it really is just a life cycle. And if you really understand the principles of security, it doesn't matter if it's IT security or principles or physical security. It's all the same thing. But if you're not thinking about it and putting those resources in terms of time, training, or money towards equipping and buying the right products, then you're just trying to put a patch on a problem that's going to continue to exist.
So anyways, we're just about out of time, but I hope we've kind of made people think about some things. I just like, the comparison of national security failure is not an option. So how can we do that with